It's just after dark on January the 9th, 2024 in the Red Sea. Radar operators on 3 U.S. Navy warships watch 18 small aircraft lift off the coast of Yemen and turn toward the shipping lanes. 2 anti-ship cruise missiles join them, then one more, moving faster, arcing in from higher altitude. 24 targets, closing fast, and every one of them needs a decision inside of seconds. The crews fire everything they've got, standard missiles, Sea Sparrows, 5-inch guns, until all 24 targets are down and nobody on those ships gets hurt. By Red Sea standards that year, it's a good night. Then somebody totals the bill. That single engagement cost the Navy something like $17 million in missiles. Almost everything it shot down cost the people who built it a few $1,000s apiece. That gap is not a one-off. It is the new math of American air defense, and this film is about the question the Pentagon can no longer avoid. Can the most expensive military ever built learn to fight cheap before cheap learns to bankrupt it? Start with the weapon everyone in this story is shooting at. It's called the Shahed 136. Iran designed it, Russia now builds its own version at a plant in Alabuga, and it costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce, depending on who's building it and how many they're making that month. It's a flying lawnmower engine bolted to a foam and plywood airframe with a warhead in the nose. Cruise speed under 120 miles an hour. It flies low, it flies slow, and Russia is now launching close to 100 a day at Ukraine on the heaviest nights. The U.S. Navy has been on the other end of that math since November of 2023. Over 15 months of fighting off Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, American destroyers fired more than 200 interceptor missiles at roughly 400 incoming drones and missiles. That's more missiles than the surface Navy had fired in combat in the previous 3 decades combined. A standard missile too runs about $2.1 million. An SM-6 is closer to $3.9 million. Fire one at a drone that cost $20,000 to build, and you've just lost the trade by a factor of over 100 to 1. Do that a few dozen times a night for months, and the ledger stops being embarrassing and starts being a strategy problem, because somewhere out there, someone is doing the math on how many $20,000 drones it takes to make a carrier strike group run out of missiles before it runs out of targets. Here's the twist. A weapon already exists on a U.S. warship that can kill a drone like this for pennies, less than the fuel it took to get the ship on station. So why isn't it on every ship in the fleet? Hold that thought. American air defense wasn't built by accident this way. For 70 years, the assumption was simple. Anything trying to kill a warship or a base was going to be expensive, because building something fast enough or precise enough to get through has always cost real money. A Soviet bomber, a supersonic cruise missile, a ballistic warhead, every one of those threats was expensive to build, which meant an expensive interceptor was still a rational trade. Kill a multi-million-dollar missile with a multi-million-dollar missile, and the arithmetic works out fine. Then commercial drone parts got cheap. Autopilots, GPS modules, small engines, all of it dropped in price over the last decade. Iran didn't have to invent anything new. It just had to bolt off-the-shelf parts onto foam and plywood and call it a weapon. The war in Ukraine turned that idea into a proven tactic. Both sides learned a drone that fails 9 times out of 10 is still a bargain if the 10th one gets through, and it only cost as much as a used car. That lesson didn't stay in Ukraine. It reached the Gulf. It reached the Red Sea. And on January 28, 2024, it reached a small American outpost in Jordan called Tower 22, where a one-way attack drone got past the base's defenses and killed 3 U.S. service members. That was the moment the cost exchange problem stopped being a budget story and became a casualty count. It also triggered a change inside the Pentagon that rarely makes headlines. A new task force got the authority to approve $50 million for a single counter-drone idea on one general signature. We'll get to why that number matters. The expensive stuff loses to the cheap stuff for a specific reason. A Shahed-type drone has a radar cross-section around the size of a large bird, roughly 1/100th of a square meter. Air defense radar built to catch fighter jets and cruise missiles was never tuned to notice something that small. It also flies low and slow, under 120 miles per hour, which sounds like a weakness until you realize it lets the drone hide in ground clutter radar operators have to actively filter out. Fast movers are easy to flag. Slow, quiet, low ones look like birds until they don't. And the drone doesn't need to survive the mission. It's expendable by design, which means the attacker can send a dozen at once from different directions and force a defender to make a dozen expensive decisions in the same 60 seconds. That's the part traditional air defense was never built for. One expensive interceptor can beat one cheap drone all day long, but a wave of 20 of them arriving together doesn't just test your radar, it tests your bank account. So that's the question the next chapters actually answer. What do you shoot back with when the missile costs more than the target and there's more than one target? The clearest answer so far has an unglamorous name, the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System, or APKWS for short. It's a laser guidance kit bolted onto an old, unguided 2.75-inch rocket that's been sitting in American inventories since Vietnam. Add the kit, and a rocket that used to miss by yards can now steer itself onto a moving target. In practice, it works like this. A sensor paints the drone with a laser, the rocket's nose reads the reflection and it steers toward it, roughly the way a heat-seeking missile works, except the whole round costs about $25,000, not $2 million. Against a Shahed, that's close to an even trade for the first time in this war. US F-16 fighters started firing a version of it, called Falco, at Houthi drones over the Red Sea in 2024. The Pentagon has since signed contracts worth over $1 billion to buy tens of thousands more of them through the end of the decade. It's not just for jets. The same rocket now fires from a launcher called Vampire, which bolts onto the back of an ordinary pickup truck, and from helicopters. It's the closest thing America has to a mass-produced one-for-one answer to a mass-produced drone. But an even trade isn't a winning trade. It stops the bleeding, it doesn't stop the war of attrition. So the industry's next move wasn't to make the bullet cheaper, it was to try to get rid of the bullet entirely. That answer is sitting on the back of one US Navy destroyer right now. It's called Helios, a 60-kilowatt laser built by Lockheed Martin and installed on the USS Preble. Point it, hold the beam on target long enough to cook the drone's skin or its electronics, and the engagement is over for a few cents, maybe less. And there's a real catch. A laser needs a clean line of sight, a stable platform, and enough dwell time on target to actually do damage. Rain, fog, dust, and heat haze all degrade the beam. So does anything that makes the target harder to track, which is most of what a drone swarm does on purpose. So the Army placed a different bet on a system called Leonidas, built by a company called Epirus. Instead of a narrow beam that has to track one target at a time, it floods an entire volume of sky with microwave energy, frying the electronics inside every drone that flies through it. One shot, potentially many kills, which matters enormously against a swarm. Both approaches share the same real-world limitation, and it isn't the physics of the beam, it's the plumbing around it. Generating that much power on a moving ship or a forward base takes a serious generator, firing it repeatedly builds up heat that has to go somewhere, and the range on both systems is still measured in miles, not the tens of miles a missile can reach. Israel's own laser system, Iron Beam, is running into the same weather and range limits. Near zero cost per shot is a real breakthrough. It is not yet a replacement for a missile that can reach out 50 miles and hit something moving at Mach 3. It's a very good answer to one very specific problem. Cheap, slow, close-in drones, which happens to be exactly the problem this film is about. Hardware alone doesn't close this gap, because the US military has historically taken years to field anything new. So in 2024, the Pentagon stood up a task force built specifically to skip that timeline. It's called JIATF 401, and it replaced an older office that had been struggling to keep pace with the threat. Its director, Brigadier General Matt Ross, can approve up to $50 million for a counter-drone program on his own signature without routing it through the normal years-long acquisition chain. That number sounds small next to a defense budget in the hundreds of billions. It buys the difference between fielding something this year and fielding it in 2031. That task force runs alongside a separate effort called Replicator, a roughly $1 billion bet the Pentagon made in 2024 and 2025 to mass-produce thousands of cheap, attritable drones and counter-drone systems instead of a handful of exquisite ones. The theory behind both programs is the same. Acquisition speed is now a weapon in its own right, not just paperwork standing between the military and the hardware it needs. Buying the right gun matters. Buying it before the enemy changes the drone matters just as much, and that's the fight nobody puts on a spec card. Now for the honest part. Not everything above has actually been tested at the scale that matters. APKWS works well against one drone, or a handful. Nobody has proven what happens when 200 arrive in the same 10 minutes from 4 directions, at night. in weather that grounds a laser. And remember that penny per shot laser from earlier? It's on exactly one ship, the USS Preble. Fitting it to the rest of the fleet means rebuilding the power and cooling plant on every hull that gets one, and that's a shipyard problem measured in years and billions, not a checkout cart. And the gap isn't only overseas. In December of 2023, unexplained drones flew over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia for weeks. The general in charge of Homeland Air Defense, Gregory Guillot, later said he wasn't prepared for how many incursions there were. The Air Force scrambled fighters and pulled in a NASA research jet to help track them. Home turf and the fastest, most expensive military on Earth still couldn't say for certain who was flying those drones or stop them. Part of that is hardware. A larger part is law. Shooting anything down over American soil runs into decades-old rules about who's allowed to fire a weapon over a populated area, and those rules were never written with $50 hobby drones in mind. Meanwhile, the other side isn't standing still. Every counter-drone system fielded so far has already prompted a cheaper workaround somewhere, a new flight profile, a decoy, a swarm tactic designed to overwhelm exactly the systems built to stop the last version of the threat. The US is not fighting a fixed target, it's fighting a moving one that gets cheaper every year it doesn't lose. So, back to the question this film opened with. Can the most expensive military on Earth learn to fight cheap before cheap bankrupts it? The honest answer is neither yes nor no. It's closer to this. On the individual shot, the US is starting to win. A $25,000 rocket against a $20,000 drone is a fair fight. A laser shot that costs pennies against a drone that costs tens of thousands of dollars is an outright win, whenever the weather cooperates and the range is short enough. But a war isn't one shot, it's thousands of them, fired under pressure, governed by laws that haven't caught up to the threat, against an adversary that adjusts every time the US does. The country is closing the gap, it has not closed it. This was never really a story about drones. It's a story about whether military power still scales with money the way it did for 80 years, or whether a $50,000 workshop and a 3D printer can now make a dent in a defense budget measured in hundreds of billions. Somewhere right now, an engineer with a much smaller budget than the Pentagon's is looking at everything you just watched and asking the same question in reverse. What does the next $20,000 weapon look like, and what will it cost the next superpower to shoot it down? That math isn't finished, it's just started keeping score.